Michael Liebreich ist Investor, Berater, Speaker und Gründer von Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Neben vielen weiteren Aktivitäten arbeitet er aktuell auch an einem Aufbau eines neuen Startups, das Ladeinfrastruktur für LKWs bereitstellen wird. Er hat in Cambridge und in Harvard studiert und heute zählt er zu einer der renommiertesten Stimmen in der internationalen Energiewende-Diskussion. Er hat unter anderem mit und für mehrere britische Premierminister gearbeitet und ist nicht nur regelmäßig Gast im Podcast, sondern betreibt auch seinen eigenen mit dem Namen Cleaning Up. Eigentlich wollte ich in dieser Episode ursprünglich über die Rolle von Ölkonzernen wie BP, Shell, Equinor und Chevron in der Energiewende sprechen und herausfinden, warum sie aktuell ihre ganzen erneuerbaren Energienprojekte zurückfahren. Doch das Gespräch wurde viel umfassender und am Ende sogar richtig motivierend. Wer hätte das gedacht bei einer Folge über Öl und Gas? Naja. Wer also einen Motivationsschub braucht, der oder die ist genau hier richtig. Noch kurz zur Info. Ich, also Julius, habe die Folge alleine und auf Englisch aufgenommen, weil sie eigentlich für meinen anderen Podcast gedacht war. Aber diese Folge ist einfach gut geworden und deswegen habe ich intern hier an der NTNU gefragt, ob wir die Folge auch über den Npower Podcast ausspielen durften. Und ich habe einen Thumbs Up bekommen dafür. Also deswegen diese Folge hier auf Englisch heute. Und weil Michael aus einer deutschsprachigen Familie stammt und früher sogar mal bei Mercedes-Benz am Band mitgearbeitet hat, gibt es von ihm auch noch ein paar Worte auf Deutsch, exklusiv für die Npower-Community, bevor der Podcast startet. Also, viel Spaß bei Folge 135 des Npower Podcasts, heute mit Michael Liebreich. Los geht's.
Hallo alle Npower-Zuhörer, ich bin Michael Liebreich. Ich könnte Deutsch sprechen, aber muss heute Englisch sprechen, weil diese Episode wird in Norwegen über den NTNU-Podcast auch publiziert. So, hello, and we're going to continue in English.
Today, the question is back to black, ? Why oil majors are retreating from renewable energies. And are they really doing that? And to discuss this topic, I'm very happy to have a special guest here today. He studied at Cambridge and at Harvard, and he is the founder of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which he sold in 2009 but stayed on as a CEO until 2014. And today he has his own consultancy business where he does a lot of consultancy and speaking, and he's also heading a boutique investment advisory called Eco Pragma. And next to that, he's also podcast host of what he calls of the podcast Cleaning Up, with more than 200 episodes. And he's also quite often on other podcasts. So welcome to the podcast, Michael Liebreich. Hi, Michael.
Julius, hello. It's a great pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you. No, it's really a pleasure to have you on this podcast today. You've been doing quite a lot of things, and you've been really avid in the energy field, if you will. But you didn't start off that way. So you studied. What did you study at Cambridge back in the day? Because you didn't. What did you study there?
Well, so Cambridge is, of course, a very unique institution where when you study engineering, as I did, you actually get a Bachelor of Arts in engineering, not a Bachelor of Science. Don't ask why. It's like a Cambridge thing. So you get a Bachelor of Arts in engineering. But my specialisms were, in fact, mechanics, fluids, thermodynamics, and nuclear. So looking back, it was actually energy engineering. That was my academic background. And I was allegedly quite good at it. So I won the university prize in thermodynamics. So that's my kind of academic, that's my academic record that I can trade on, whatever it is now, 40 years later.
Yeah. But you went out of that field. So you had this energy related training, if you will, but then you went into consultancy business. And I like that on your LinkedIn profile, it says you were working with cheese industry, perfumes, life insurance, food flavors, fragrances, and photographic paper. So what was it that dragged you into these very diverse fields, if you will?
Skiing.
So only.
Yes. Well, so what happened was that in parallel with, sort of going off and studying, I was a mad keen skier and I was quite good. I wasn't quite sure how good, but it turned out that I was actually very good. So I took some time after Cambridge and was a ski bum and started to do competitions, ended up in the British team, ended up on the podium at Europa Cup level in a few competitions, ended up being the British champion. And suddenly my discipline, which was moguls, became an Olympic sport. So I went to the Olympics 1992, but to do that, I actually needed to earn money and work. So I remained after business school. I remained a consultant. Well, I was a management consultant before business school. So while I did all of that, and then after business school, joined McKinsey and had this weird double life where in the winter I was a ski bum, and in the an athlete, a competitor, no longer a ski bum. And then during the rest of the year, I was off, fixing the cheese industry, the insurance industry, the bits and pieces of the food industry, flavorings, fragrances, all sorts of, and all of this, by the way, is very relevant to what I do today. Steve Jobs gave a graduation speech, and he talked to a bunch of students about how they should think about their career. And he said, you've got to do things that fascinate you and that you learn from, and you won't know why and how they'll contribute, because he said you can only join the dots looking backwards. And that is so true for me, because yes, I put myself through Cambridge working in a car factory, and now I'm expected to know all about the shift to electric vehicles. And I know that industry, not just actually from the car factory, but also because I worked in the food industry. So I'm now building an eHGV business, charging business, pan-European. I've been in a lot of warehouses and I've dodged a lot of forklift trucks because I've done crazy stuff in the food industry while I was at McKinsey, a lot of stuff for McKinsey in the food industry. So the things that I did, even cheese. What is cheese? Cheese is bioprocessing. If you want to have a view on biofuels or bioplastics, it really helps to know just something about what happens when you harvest a product and you have to keep it at the same quality through the year and so on. So it's it's all weird, and none of it was wasted.
That's really good to hear, because I feel a lot of students have the feeling at 20 you have to know where you're going to go, and your plea just kind of confirms that it's okay to try things out, because as you said, you will understand the dots when you look backwards, and they're all helpful.
To put it in exact context, I did not start New Energy Finance until I was 41, and if you look at what I do now, I am absolutely at the heart of energy, transport, transition, development, finance. It's like I am me, but that only really started when I was 41. I had 41 years of kind of assembling bits and scraps to kind of do this collage, which is what I am now.
Really nice, yeah. And what was the final piece that you needed before starting New Energy Finance?
Becoming unemployed. I was very involved in the .com boom bust cycle. So I had always been very interested in the internet, but not just as a sort of social phenomenon, a media communications phenomenon, but also for what it would do to supply chains. And so I got very involved in the whole tech boom cycle of 1998, 99, 2000. Joined Group Arno, built a team, and I was the UK guy investing in all of that TMT tech stuff for Bernard Arnault. And then
who's the chairman of LVMH, no?
LVMH, exactly. So this thing was called Europe at Web, and it was terribly of its time. I was there partly because I knew it was a boom and would be followed by a bust, and I wanted to be on a big balance sheet. But when Bernard Arnault sort of lost his investor confidence in that space and stopped investing, I basically dismantled the team, fired myself. So I was the person who switched off the lights in the office and was then deeply, deeply unemployed and unemployable because of all those associations with .com stuff. So that was the final trigger. And I went back to my roots. I thought, by that time I had built, I had done those energy studies early on. I'd also built an international news agency, Associated Press Television. I'd been deputy managing director. So I kind of pulled together, and then I had all these weird dots in the rearview mirror that I pulled together. And it's almost like the only thing I was then qualified to do was to start New Energy Finance, but I was uniquely well qualified to do that. So I did it.
And there's this little story that you sometimes tell, how you came up with that name. And how did you come up with that name? Because I understand you kind of copied that name and just adjusted it to your field.
That's right. There was a newsletter called New Media Finance, and it was all about new media, the internet, and social media, as was then. The funny thing was, it was a paper publication. It literally arrived, it hit people's desks in a paper form, wrapped in plastic. That was the way it was done then. And I resolved that I would never do that. I would never have a printed version. It would be fully virtual to start with. But I called it New Energy Finance because I wanted to provide information to investors. At the end of the day, the transition is very, very simple. If we spend the money, if we invest the money, we will build something new. And if we don't, we will not build something new. It's really, so the money is absolutely at the heart of this. And so I didn't want to cover clean energies from a technology perspective. Although I have a strong academic background, I'm not the biggest expert on, quantum dots, solar, nano, but I am uniquely, I think, able to sit in the middle of whether it's the finance, the policymakers, the technologists, and the big energy companies, that there's a kind of gap in the middle where you have to do translations between all of those. And because of this kind of weird eclectic background that I had by then, I was able to speak these 4 different languages: the energy language, the policy language, the tech language, and so on. And and the finance language. So I became kind of the translator.
You're building such a nice bridge here to my first large question, but there's one small thing that I would like to ask you before. And so the next question is, today you do a lot of speaking gigs, you work as a consultant. What is it what people hope to get from you, or what is your value proposition to them? Why do people hire you?
Well, so let me just say that there's 3, broadly speaking, everything I do falls into 3 buckets. So that just sort of make it simpler to understand what I do. I have a kind of media business where I write for Bloomberg still. I do my YouTube channel. It's a podcast, Cleaning Up, but it's also a YouTube channel. We now have more watchers than listeners. And I also do this paid speaking. So that's my media business, Liebreich Associates. I then have all of my investing activities now comes under Ecopragma Capital. We're doing corporate finance. We will be getting into asset management in due course. There's a team forming there with a friend of mine from business school, Henry Lawson, and I'm very excited about that piece. And then the third one is NGO or, charitable stuff, philanthropic work. And that could be anything from, I've just come back from Sierra Leone, and where I was looking at a project where I put solar and batteries with a bunch of us raised the money, and I led the project to put a reliable power supply into a neonatal intensive care unit, because a baby without, that needs oxygen and needs heat, and the nurses need light to look after it. You get, if there's a power cut, the babies will start dying 20 minutes later. And so there was this unit with a brilliant doctor, brilliant medical team, but they reached the limits of what they could do with the lights going off and the electricity going off all the time. So I, sort of wielded my influence, brought the money together, and we did that. And there's a nice synergy with the media business, because I did an episode on cleaning up, which is very moving, because the nurses, the mothers, you see these kids, these toddlers running around that would otherwise perhaps have passed away. But I also have been on the board of Transport for London. So there's some very kind of high level stuff, Sustainable Energy for All, which became SDG 7 within the UN system. I was on the high level group there that pushed that through. And I also was on the UK Board of Trade. So I worked with Liz Truss and Kemi Badenoch, who both in turn became Conservative Party leaders.
Yeah. Yeah, that was in 2022, is it? Also, one on your LinkedIn profile, I like that you just mentioned Liz Truss, but on your LinkedIn profile, you also say appointed by Boris, reappointed for 2.5 years by Sadiq. So just for people who know who these people are, it's kind of interesting that you just point to their first names.
Yes,
that's really nice.
these are the two
Cute.
mayors of London under whom I served as on the board of Transport for London. Boris, I did 4 years under Boris Johnson, who of course went on to become Prime Minister. Sadiq Khan, who would like to have become Prime Minister, but was sort of pipped to it by Sir Keir Starmer, the current Prime Minister, for however long that lasts, who knows. In the light of, we just had local elections today, which were very poor for all of the major parties. But I came off the board of Transport for London. Sadiq and I do not see eye to eye. I actually stayed on. I begged to stay on when Boris moved on and Sadiq won the election to be mayor of London. I begged to stay on, funnily enough, not to work on clean energy and sustainability issues or on the finance issues. I was on the finance committee and Crossrail was going, at the time, horribly wrong. But because of safety issues, I had uncovered a very, very poor safety culture in London buses, principally, and I was determined to fix that. And so I begged to stay on. Sadly, I would say that I failed to fix it, and management, management won. Sadiq backed the management with what I call an institutionally unsafe safety culture, which I couldn't tolerate. So I'm off the board.
Yeah, maybe that's sometimes what you have to do when your voices don't get through, or when you feel that other people are making the decision that you're not feeling comfortable with anymore.
Well, Julius, particularly when people are dying as a result of the failure to address systemic institutional issues, which is the case with London buses.
Rough decision. It sounds not as if it's been resolved so far.
No, I continue to work on it. Listen, I'm sorry, I'm distracting. Your audience is probably going, what the hell's going? This is going off in a weird direction. But I use these opportunities because you never know who's listening, and there absolutely needs to be change because it is unacceptable, the current situation. So I'm sorry for dropping that in and kind of distracting.
Plug that in. Yeah. No, that's fine. So, but then let's do energy. Let's talk about energy. And you just mentioned a similar sentence, but on the Transmissions podcast in February 23, I think you said a sentence which kind of stuck with me because it's so to the point, I feel. And it says, if the money flows, we will live in a world of clean energy. If it does not, we won't. So if we start this as like the very big picture question in the beginning of this podcast, where do you see where we are? Is the money flowing? And I'm not talking about Trump and Truss right now or the last couple of 6 weeks, but overall, give us the picture, your picture, how you would paint it from the last 5 years, 10 years. Where are we? And is it enough money that is flowing into renewable energy and low carbon technologies?
Okay, so at the big picture level, there's about $2 trillion that goes into energy each year. Investment in energy. I'm not talking about buying petrol. I'm talking about investing in oil fields or in the alternatives and so on. About 2 trillion. In fact, it's higher now. It's about it's just under 3 trillion. Of course, you can add to that the boundaries of where money flows into energy are very fluid. So, for instance, you buy a new washing machine, and that washing machine has a better motor with permanent magnets than the last washing machine. Is that an energy investment? No, it's a washing machine, right? So when the clear boundaries, when I talk about the 2 rising to 3 trillion, that's really investment in the power generation, in the grid, in upstream, midstream, downstream, oil, gas, in coal mines, and so on. So it's really a fairly narrow definition, in a sense, of the energy industry, which has these tentacles, in your washing machine, in your car, and everywhere. And I do include the kind of in the numbers, the drivetrains of the car. So the motor of the car or the battery and the electric motors, but not the whole car, because then you get into these kind of huge trillions, but it's sort of irrelevant because most of that is the car, not the energy piece, if you like. So of that, at the time when I started New Energy Finance, 2004, I was the first person to count how much money is going into, in a sense, the clean stuff. And, at that point, it was mainly wind. Even solar hadn't really started in 2004. And I counted all the bits of venture capital and private equity and so on. And there was, setting aside investment in the grid, which was only a few hundred million and has now grown considerably, finally. But actually just going into the clean energy piece, it was about, I think it was $36 billion globally. And that was it. There was 36 billion. There was a couple of 100 million going into grid and grid upgrades and grid extension in the global south. And the rest was all oil, gas, coal. So it was, let's call it, maybe it was 10-15% clean or clean plus grid. It was very low percent. It was actually much lower than that clean, but clean plus grid was 10 or 15%. Where are we today? Well, today, over $2 trillion last year went into clean energy plus the grid. And only about 700 billion went into oil, gas, coal, and everything else. So we've gone from 15% clean to, if I do the numbers very roughly, I would say that's probably 70% clean. So that's and that's very, very big picture. And by the way, what's going on now with President Trump and the U.S. administration being so sort of aggressively anti-clean and pro-fossil will make almost no difference at that level. Almost no difference. There will be a few tens or hundreds of billions spent, but when you take a few hundred billion over a 4-year period of his presidency, it turns out to be a few tens of billions per year. But if you think of it as coming out of a nearly $3 trillion pie, you're really not changing much. It has, there's all sorts of cultural stuff going on, and it's empowering all sorts of people and so on. But the actual flow of capital is not going to dramatically change because of what's happening in the US.
And that's, thanks for pointing that out. And I feel that's maybe one of the largest misconceptions that we have in the renewable energy bubble, or in the low carbon bubble, or whatever, is that you mentioned it right now, that there's this cultural shift maybe going on. And I feel a lot of hope maybe being lost these days because of all actions that the Trump administration is put into place. And then we have the war in Ukraine, and now a lot of money needs to go into defense now. And this is all maybe money that doesn't really flow anymore into renewable energy projects, or less. So it's nice to see that this, that you, from your perspective, it's maybe a bit more than a blurb, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not as much as one might think.
Well, no, let me take those two different things. One is the sort of there's a bunch of narratives out there about how net zero is kind of hit the rocks, right? There was no transition. It was only ever additive. It was only, and so on. There's those narratives, and we've just had Tony Blair in the UK has come out and said there needs to be a reset. I agree. In fact, what's annoying about Tony Blair's intervention was that I am in the process of writing a piece about how there needs to be a climate net zero reset. I have a different prescription for what it looks like from Tony Blair, but he's right that there is now a response needed, because those kind of I was going to say there's the narratives. There's also, let me actually maybe deal with the second piece and come back to those narratives. The second piece about Ukraine is you posit that if you spend money on defense, you can't spend money on clean energy. And I completely reject that, because money is not, in the financial system, you don't have a pot of money that you can either spend on this or that. You can actually finance anything that makes sense. The capital markets can multiply money as long as stuff makes sense. That's because we've got this kind of the ability to create debt, the ability to create money at will by financial institutions, which means that all you need is stuff that makes sense, and the money will happen. Also, if you actually talk to the people who are at the front line of defense, then listen to what they are saying. They need, for instance, to be able to charge drones. They need resilience. So they don't need vast centralized power stations that can be taken down with a single attack. What they need is distributed solutions, secure solutions. They need batteries, pervasive through the system. So a lot of what we need for defense is actually in line with a lot of the technologies and the developments and the software that we need for resilience and for, look at what happened in Spain and Portugal. The grid fell over. They should be talking to their counterparts in Ukraine, right? Because in Ukraine, at any time, any power station could be taken out, or multiple power stations within fractions of a second. And I'll bet you that the Ukrainians could could know more about how do you keep a grid stable than perhaps those people in Spain, had thought. So, but coming back to that one, I think is a false oppositionality, and we can come back and talk more about the energy implications of Ukraine if you want. But on those narratives, the transition, the easy transition narrative is something that I have fought against quite hard for a long time. There's no easy transition. There are people who say, oh, solar became cheap, so it's game over for gas. Well, hang on a second. How do you get through this so-called Dunkelflaute, the 2 weeks with no wind and during winter, so very low solar, or not no wind, but very low wind, very low solar. You cannot just say, as a serious person, you cannot just say, oh, solar became so cheap, or oh, batteries are becoming so cheap. You're not going to do 2 weeks using batteries. So we need grown-up, serious consideration, and we need the engineering solutions, and then we need the policy frameworks, and then we need the finance to flow, and then the solutions will be built. If we spend the money, but we'll only spend the money if we've had a serious conversation, followed by an engineering design, followed by the policy design, followed by the financiers able to step in and profitably fund the solutions. So it's not just flip the switch and the money flows. It is more complicated than that. But so I do push back against the easy transition narrative, but I also push back against the narrative that the transition is not happening. Of course, it's not happening as fast as, it's not going to be a 1.5 degree transition. It's not going to be net zero 2050. But if anybody thinks that we're not in the middle of a massive technological change to cleaner energy, maybe not fully clean, but cleaner energy, then they're just not paying attention.
Yeah. And the question, I agree with you, and I like that you're being so clear, is not if the transition happens. The question is how fast it happens, isn't it? Because we will have a transition to renewable energies and low carbon technologies. The question is how fast are we getting there?
There's two questions really. There's how fast, and where does it start to sort of saturate, in a sense? Where is it a 50% transition, a 75% transition, a 90%, 95%, or 100%? Of course, the purists, they would be, Greta Thunberg would say it has to be tomorrow and it has to be 100%, right? I can tell you right now that's not going to happen, right? But it's going to, in my view, it's going to be, let's call it, if you go through to 2070, so give us 50 years, or 2075, 50 years, it will be more than 90%. We'll be more than 90% off fossil fuels. And fundamentally, the reason is burning stuff is stupid, right? Burning stuff is stupid thermodynamically, it's stupid environmentally, and it's stupid economically. And so we will stop doing that, but it may take 50 years to largely, almost completely stop doing that.
Yeah, and there are so many barriers. For example, like you just said, it's stupid also from a price perspective. But if we, for example, see entrenched regimes in countries like Indonesia, they make a lot of money, or the regimes or the governments make a lot of money because they own the coal plants, and so there's like a lot of entrenched interest as well that maybe that make it not so easy. But
well, that's right. And if you look at policy decisions, right, it's very easy as a progressive. I mean, I would call myself, I'm on the right of politics, the center right, but I would call myself a progressive. I want to see change and I want to see improvement and human progress, and I'm prepared to kind of, I'm not a libertarian, I'm a progressive. But it's very tempting, and lots of people on the left are progressives as well. It's very easy to think that the goal of policy is to improve human conditions, the economy and outcomes for people. A lot of policy actually is seen through needs to be seen through the lens of, can it be used to raise taxes? Because the real big problem is actually raising taxes. What you actually do if you're elected is try to raise taxes, or not necessarily raise them, but kind of harvest money from the economy whilst getting re-elected is the core challenge. If you can't harvest money from the economy, you can't do anything. And if you can't get elected, you can't do anything. And so, the lens through which an Indonesian government is looking at this is not how do we improve the lot of, number one, Indonesians, and number two, the world. It is how do we get hold of some money to do stuff, whatever that is, and how do we get re-elected? And of course, if you are looking at a much purer petro state, one that was really funded, Saudi Arabia or an Angola, which sees the only big source of money being fossil fuels, then you can talk as much as you want about transitions, but it's absolutely clear that those are seen as antithetical, as harmful to that country's prospects and to the ability to do the two core jobs of money of government, which is getting hold of some money and then staying in power.
Yeah, you forgot to mention one other country that also is very much
Russia.
Dependent on Norway, where I'm based.
Norway, yes. Norway is fascinating, and I've worked very closely. I was until recently an advisor to Equinor, and Norway is absolutely fascinating because I do believe that Norway, in good faith, the government does want to improve the lot of Norwegians and the world, and is in a sense embarrassed by the fact that its major source of income is fossil related. But it's generally, I think it is in good faith grappling with that. I don't know if embarrassed is the right word, but at least in Norway, it's very clear that there is this kind of conundrum that needs to be solved. Whereas in some countries, although they may pay lip service, they may send an environment minister to a COP meeting and so on. Fundamentally, they don't want climate action. They would rather we spend the next, 75 years, 150 years in a hotter and hotter planet with all that brings, because that is something, the bad things happen out into the future and generally somewhere else in the world. And so they would like this stuff to just go away.
Yeah. Now you just mentioned Equinor, Michael. So let's maybe try to make sense then of the role of these oil majors in the whole overall transition. You mentioned the transition is not stoppable. It depends a bit how much time we take, but it is on its way. Then there is opportunities. There's a lot of money flowing in. But then now in the last couple of months and also last year, we saw a bit of, goals being slashed. And I'm just going to give the audience a couple of insights here. So, for example, in March 2024, Shell announced that they would scrap their 2035 objective for 45 reduction in net carbon intensity. Equinor this year on February 5th announced that they would retire their goal of allocating 50% of their gross capital investments by 2030. So they said they would invest 50% into renewables and low carbon by 2030. And they said, we're not going to be able to do that. They also lowered their target on installed renewable capacity and halved their investments into renewable overall. And also BP this year, so that was 3 weeks after Equinor, they said they have plans to reduce the investments to renewable and low carbon tech from $5 billion USD annually to maximum $2 billion USD annually. And all of these companies have had quite a number of renewable energy investments. So, for example, Shell has bought Sonnen and Next in Germany, virtual battery companies, then a lot of investments into offshore wind. And we've also seen that with Equinor and also with Total. So how come that while we are on the big train of the energy transition, these oil majors who have a lot of capacity and financial power, if you might, why are they a bit like backing out? What's the reason behind it?
So I think if you look at, if you postulate a world sort of post-transition or in the late stages of transition, whenever that's going to be, then there's two possible ways that might look. There might be a whole bunch of companies called, Shell, Total, BP, Chevron, Exxon, Aramco, Petronas, Sinopec, etc., still at the commanding heights of the energy space, because they've transitioned. But now what they do is wind, solar, geothermal, small modular reactors, whatever it is, whatever technology, fusion, whatever it is, that those same companies are still in the driving seat. There's another world where they have essentially shriveled away to almost nothing. And I think that what we're really seeing is that debate is over. If there's to be a transitioned world, those companies will not be at the commanding heights, right? Because we had this, activists putting pressure on Shell to become the energy company of the future. In a way, I suppose it's always struck me as fairly naive, because if you look at any other transition, whether it was horse carriages to cars, or whether it was mainframe computers to distributed computing,
sailboats to engine boats, or
yes, exactly, sails to motors, or all of the transitions, a whole class of companies has essentially disappeared in almost all cases. I mean, you could say, well, there's these Japanese trading houses, but they're trading houses. Banks endure, trading houses endure. Companies that are through and through identified with a particular technology tend not to make the transition. And there's reasons for that within the companies, cultural reasons. Cost of capital is a big problem. You've got an investor base that wants a certain type of risk and return. And now you've got a different industry that's growing to supplant and destroy that industry. And different investors will be attracted to back the players because it has a different risk profile. For instance, when you're growing an entire new energy industry, it's absolutely clear it's going to suck in a huge amount of capital. But the investors in oil and gas companies are actually interested in getting cash out of the businesses. Oil and gas distributes capital. Clean energy absorbs capital. So why would it be the same investors? It's sort of, in a way, it's, it may not have been obvious. I wrote a piece a few years ago about the two different strategies, the bookends of an oil company strategy, oil and gas company strategy. You could either say, I'm going to transition and still be at the commanding heights after the transition, or you could say, no, as long as the world needs oil and gas, which it will do quite clearly for decades and decades, and it's kind of, what I talked about in that piece was that it is actually completely morally, ethically acceptable to be an oil and gas company and say, I'm not doing clean energy. Right? Why? Because all of those Just Stop Oil protesters, they go home and their house is warm, and it's warm because of fossil fuels, right? Now, that doesn't mean they can't protest, and it doesn't mean there isn't a transition. It doesn't mean anything. It just means that right now, to keep people warm and to get people to school and to go and fly off somewhere and see your relatives in Australia, you need fossil fuels, and it's perfectly legal and it's morally and ethically acceptable to deliver that. What's not acceptable is spreading rumors, spreading misinformation about how other solutions can't work, or undermining, using your policy influence to undermine policy initiatives that might accelerate the transition for the good of people and planet and so on. But just supplying fossil fuels is not in and of itself a bad thing. You cannot, I use fossil fuels. You use fossil fuels. We all use plastics. So I can't demonize a company that provides a product that I buy. I would like there to be other products that are, that don't have the negatives. And I work all day, every day on trying to make those happen. But demonization is not part of my toolkit. And I don't think it should be part of our toolkit. So what's happening with these companies is that, just in the numbers that I shared, essentially the energy sector, 70% of all investment is now going into clean stuff and the grid. And 30% is still oil, gas, coal, upstream, midstream, downstream, and it's shrinking. So those companies, they are essentially, their zone of operation is shrinking to that 30%. That's fine, but that's not the whole story, because there's still the 70%, and there's plenty of capital and plenty of players that are in that other 70% of activity.
Now, Michael, one could say that these the decision makers in these companies, they're probably not stupid people. They're very highly educated. They look at their project and they see, okay, my return on investment on an oil rig or, a new well is probably higher in the next 10 years than it is in, a utility scale solar plant. Is it just naive, or is that easy from us to say it's naive, or is it that their incentive scheme is maybe only the next 5 to 10 years? Because you alluded to that policymakers want to be reelected, and maybe business executives just want to have a good numbers when they leave the job in 5 to 10 years. Is it lack of long-term thinking? Because it's probably not intellect, because these people are smart.
It's absolutely not intellect. I mean, I've worked with a lot of executives in oil companies, they're brilliant. They're brilliant people. Not just the Equinor people that I worked with, whether they were on the renewables or the clean energy side, or whether they were on the oil side, but across the board. There's a lot of things going on. So one that I alluded to would be the cost of capital. That it's just, if you're oil and gas, the way it works is that the prices are volatile, right? $65, $80, $0, $140, it's volatile. But when the oil price is high, the things become, ludicrously profitable, windfall profits. And you've seen the calls in Norway, the super taxes and so on, because they become so profitable that in the lean years they may make no money, but in the good years they make so much money that it enormously outweighs it. And so that is a certain, investors understand that, they can model that. There's a whole industry of information providers and also hedging type approaches. Look at how Mexico, hedges its oil sales and so on. So there's a whole, that's a very comfortable place to be, and it provides, on a risk-adjusted basis, returns that those investors like. Now you go to build an offshore wind farm, and suddenly your key skill, apart from some of the engineering, but it's all about how much leverage can you get, how much low-cost debt can you get, because the returns are much more. You can sell against either a long-term policy signal or a long-term power purchase agreement. You've got a fixed price for your output. And then you can leverage against that, and it's all about your credit rating and about financial engineering. It's a very, very different type of return than for oil. And if you look at something like unconventional oil, you can start to be cash flow positive in a year. You can pay off the whole thing. In fact, you have to, because of the decline rates on the wells. That's very different from an offshore wind farm, which is a long-term investment. And then solar, of course, is very different, because solar, you look at what's happening. For instance, Pakistan went from 3 gigawatts of solar imported in 2024, or around a sort of an 18-month period, 22 gigawatts of solar and batteries. Why? Because the grid was unreliable. And so for the investor in that solar, it was like, I am losing money in my business. I can put solar and a battery in, and I can have reliable power for my food processing or my apartment block or whatever it is. So they're just very different cash cycles in those different businesses. And one of the things is, and actually, as I worked with, oil companies, and whether it's just going in and making a presentation or being an advisor, it always struck me that the only way they were going to make this work, if they were going to do the transition, it was by spinning out their clean energy activities so that they only partly owned them, and then bringing in external investors. So having a part-owned subsidiary. So BP toyed with the idea of having BP Alternative Energy back in, 2007 timeframe, because then you could have the oil company owning enough of the activity to sort of be worth providing all the synergies, the influence with the politicians, the balance sheet, the engineering skills, the risk management skills, the project management skills. But you could bring in new capital. The bulk of the capital that would be used would be capital that doesn't mind or that likes the cash flow of the clean energy activities. And none of these companies wanted to go there. None of them did that. Except, funnily enough, last year, in a small way, Equinor, through its purchase of a piece of Ørsted, has, in a sense, got a sort of 10% owned clean energy thoroughbred subsidiary, which is a very interesting first move. I have no inside knowledge from my work with Equinor, but I could envisage a future where Equinor offloads all of its clean energy stuff into Ørsted in exchange for owning 40% or 60% or 35%, whatever the number is, and that then becomes a very comfortable capital structure to pursue both of those businesses, the oil and gas and the clean energy.
I'm not so sure I could totally follow this. What is the key argument why you would do that in a subsidiary structure where you have other investors in it? Why would you not have it under your umbrella as an oil company?
Because so many of your investors don't want you to. They don't want to put so much capital. And I don't want to use examples from Equinor, because it will give the impression that because I was an advisor that I've been party to these conversations, which I wasn't. But if somebody, if an investor really wants to be in the business of exploring and exploiting oil and gas, and then vast amounts of capital are used to do something else, those investors will say, well, in that case, I'll sell my shares in, Total, BP, Shell, Equinor, whatever, and I'll just be in Exxon at that point, or Petronas, because all I want is exposure to that. So, if you can, I suppose this model of the naive model of oil and gas companies transitioning, that's the only reason you would do that is if they had a unique ability to develop the new business. Because if not, they should simply generate cash from oil and gas, give it back to investors, and let the investors choose the best opportunities to build the new businesses. If there was no synergy, then absolutely, as an investor, I would much rather give the money to a specialist in oil and gas, or to a specialist in, depending on what I want to do, a specialist in clean energy. The only reason you don't want to do that as an investor, whether you would be happy to leave your money in a company that is doing a transition, is if there was a synergy. If it was so clear that those companies were racing ahead and able to more competently and at lower risk deliver the new solutions. But, what do we see? We see these big oil and gas companies actually having trouble building businesses in clean energy. They manage it a bit, right? You get, Shell doing biofuels in Brazil, or you get, you get Equinor owning some very good wind assets and very adeptly, selling them down and generating some cash along the way, historically, as they've done. But generally, and by the way, we could talk about the car industry. Daimler did not create the world's most technologically advanced electric car. Tesla did. Why? Because the nimble outsider beats the bureaucratic insider. And by the way, for your listeners that want to explore why, the guru on this was somebody I was very lucky to study with, actually, at Harvard Business School. He came in and took some classes along with me, and when he was doing his PhD, Clayton Christensen.
Oh, disruptive innovation.
A number of books on the sort of the attacker's advantage. Why it is that new technology waves are generally driven by new players and not by old.
So deriving from what you just said, Michael, would you then say if you were talking to someone who just graduated from university, for example, would you always say if you want to make a difference, then you should go to a startup company, a new company, a rising company, and not try to help converting, if that's the right term, these oil industry companies? Or is that naive
I think
too?
Definitely don't try and convert an oil company, because they are now set on their path, which is the path of focusing on their core business. And but whether you go to a startup or not is it's a question about personal sort of risk tolerance and so on. What I personally did was that I actually, in my career, I've done startups and I've done big brands. So I've taken enormous risk, but I feel like I have a license to take risk because I was at McKinsey and Harvard Business School and Cambridge and the Olympics. So I got lots of brands that I can draw on. Bloomberg. After I sold to Bloomberg, I could afford to kind of play around a bit and be a startup because, I could. Nobody can dismiss me as a gadfly or and that's also one of the reasons why I very much liked working with the World Economic Forum. Way back in the day, I did some free work for them, but especially the UN, the Board of Trade, Transport for London, because that gives me the gravitas to go and do. I did some travel tech startups, all of which were unsuccessful, but I don't have to. They don't define me. The fact that I created Complete Skier, If You Ski, and Pearl Share, and these were horrible failures, but it doesn't matter. So if you're graduating, you got to think about your. Basically, I think what I'm saying is, think about your brand. Don't think about. It's not just a question of startup versus incumbent. Think about how you are going to draw your dots together that we talked about, the things that you've got in your background. But think about your brand. It's really good to get a few years with a branded company, a Uniper or an RWE in this space, a McKinsey. Get that on your resume because it reassures when you do go and do some crazy stuff and go and join a startup and do blockchain, crypto, AI,
NFT,
inevitably fail, as the vast majority of them will and should. But it doesn't matter because you can always say, yeah, but I did do three, I was marketing manager at RWE, or I was whatever it was. And you can draw on that.
I had this other question written down, Michael, and we're coming a bit to the end of the episode. So I had this question written down. Is it a policy question, or how should we change policies maybe to make renewable or low carbon technologies and solutions more financially attractive? So my thinking was, okay, oil and gas companies have very attractive business models right now because the projects are really attractive, and renewable and low carbon are not. So should we change the policy in a way, or try to be more creating projects that are more financially attractive in order to get the cash and get these big project developers or these large oil companies into the renewable energy space? But now I feel you actually made the point quite clearly that you don't see them in these field of action anyways. So what would you think about European policymaking in order to advance maybe the transition and hopefully to accelerate it?
Right. So, I mean, I'm very happy if they do, allocate capital into the space. I don't want to make it sound like they should be rejected or pushed out, or as definitely not demonized. But if space is attractive, investors will put money in it. They might do it through, Equinor, Shell, Total, BP, whoever. But they might also do it through, whatever vehicle they choose, whatever company they choose. And by the way, there are some very interesting companies that are smaller oil and gas companies, that are transitioning actually very nimbly. And I'm thinking of Varo Energy in Switzerland and so on. So there's some really interesting companies.
You mentioned Ørsted, and Ørsted used to be an oil and gas company. True.
It's an interesting one for me to mention because, I love Ørsted. I think they've done an incredible job getting to where they are. They're also, however, a sort of almost a poster child for overreach and for the readjustment. And so, in a few years' time, Ørsted will either be, back on the pedestal as a fantastic example of, actually, that was an oil and gas company. It was Dong. It was the Danish oil and gas provider. So it'll either be back to being a poster child for the transition, or it'll have sort of withered and not. I mean, or it might be the kind of, I suppose it could be the Equinor clean energy subsidiary. Who knows where it goes? But in terms of making it more attractive, I think this is the reset that I think we need to talk about, that we've gone from, feed-in tariffs, right? Guarantee a very high price for anybody who's brave enough to put their toe in the water. Okay, it worked, but it's a very expensive way of getting people to invest in clean energy. Broadly speaking then, and I was part of I don't want to say a movement, but I was a loud voice saying we needed the price signals. We need reverse auctions because these solar and wind companies were getting very high prices, and the cost reductions that we all know, the learning curve cost reductions, were not being passed on to the consumer. So an industry was being built, and we're talking about sort of the period 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11. It was an industry that was entirely in the gift of some bureaucrat saying the price for solar is 50 cents or 40 cents or 28 cents with very expensive prices. They were coming down, but very, very slowly. And I said, no, you got to have price discovery. You go to reverse auctions. And then when that started to happen, 2012, 13, 14, 15, we went to reverse auctions. And that was when the world woke up to cheap, clean energy. The problem is that it was almost too successful. We've built a lot of it. We have a lot of countries now that have got, 20, 30%, 15, 20, 25, 30, 40%, or even higher of variable renewables. And they're starting to get more and more constraints. The electricity prices are going to, very low or to zero or below zero whenever it's windy and sunny, because we're shoving money at companies to build indiscriminately more and more supply all at the same time of the day or the same season. And we've got to reset and rethink, because we have a problem of flexible supply. I'm not going to call it base load, because 24/7 power, that's not interesting anymore, because when it's sunny or windy, you don't need it. But what you do need is flexible supply, and batteries are great, but they don't and they won't be on a scale to deal with the Dunkelflaute, or even a reliability to deal with if you're running an aluminium smelter or you're running an energy intensive process. So we have to think much harder about how do we provide flexible power. By the way, what we could do is focus on reducing the amount of flexible power we require and then just leave it as gas. That's also possible. Leave it as natural gas. So if we only have to cover the Dunkelflaute, if 2% of the 1 week per year is 2% of the time, who cares whether it's gas? It can be hydrogen, but if it's 10 times or 20 times the cost, forget it. We just won't do it. So we've got to reset to think about flexibility, give rewards for flexibility of all sorts, and then who cares who invests? If we fix that, if we create those frameworks, the money will arrive.
There's so much in there. Maybe one last thought there is but when we think about times like Dunkelflaute, 2 weeks in the winter in Central Europe or whatever, and we want to have capacity that can take care of that. And for example, with natural gas, and then we don't really use it that much at all, because otherwise it is so expensive because of the prices from the European from the ETS, the emission trading scheme. Then this means that we have to make investments that are kind of paid off by 2 weeks of running in a year, which makes it really expensive. And the question is, who will do that? On the other end, the prices will then be respectively high, so that this can pay back.
Well, the answer is yes, you will have to have resources for those 2 weeks a year or 1 week per year, and they will sit idle. And the quid pro quo, though, is that the electricity the rest of the year has to be really, really cheap. Yeah, I mean, obviously. And so that's energy efficiency and very low cost resources and lots of digital capability to make it cheap the rest of the year. And then a policy framework that says those 2 weeks that are really expensive get blended for the user across the whole year. So they are a few % increase across the year, because what you can't do is say to somebody, you're trying to heat your house. Sorry, it's a Dunkelflaute, and the next 2 weeks are going to cost you €1,000. The rest of the year will only cost you €500, right? That person is going to switch the heating off and suffer. What you really need is €1,500 across the year or whatever, and then it gets blended and financed not at the interest rate or the cost of capital of a very modest and vulnerable family, but maybe financed at the cost of big financial institutions, or even in some cases with some state guarantees. So can it be done? 100%. 100% it can be done, but we need to really get our best brains working on that, and not listen to all of the, it's so much easier to promote a narrative of net zero has failed or it can't work and so on. So forget it. We progressives across the political spectrum, we need to move on to solve the next set of problems. And by the way, I'm going to say this because this is an energy podcast, or two energy podcasts, right? Because this is going out on NTNU as well as NPower. Zonal pricing, right? We have to get those price signals now to differentiate regions that have got very cheap and very reliable clean energy. Have to be able to pass on that energy, dump it on the market at low cost. And what you've got right now is enormous resistance to that by incumbents who like the current system, where they get paid and they don't take the risk. They don't take the volume risk. They don't take the price risk. They love the system. They're lobbying hard. And I'm sorry, but we need the price signals. And this is a big debate in the UK, big debate in Germany, big debate in Chile, big debate anywhere where you've reached a decent proportion of clean energy and you have different sort of weather zones or different resources in different parts of the country. You've got to just bite the bullet and go to zonal. And that will lower the costs for everybody. But at the expense of people who want to build ridiculous amounts of transmission and people who want to be paid for not taking risk, for building generation in the wrong place and then be paid not to use it.
Yeah, that's what we see very much in Germany, that there's a lot of people wanting to build renewable energy in the north, but there's no need for it in the north. And they would not like to have several zones where then the price in the north would be low and they would be more incentivized to actually build up their project in the south. In Norway, we have five zones, so that's easier and that's already a bit taken care of. We started, Michael, last question. We started with a lot of, I liked it, with a lot of hope of like this transition is happening anyways. Then we went into the role of like incumbents and oil incumbents and maybe their role and how they can be incentivized. And that's what we talked about as well in the end. For the people who sometimes feel that these narratives are too negative, what are like the 1, 2, 3 things that you would like to say to these people so that we can continue fighting? Because yes, we are in a process that it's happening, but it could happen faster. And we need all our smart brains, as you also just mentioned, on these very challenging challenges or problems. So what would be your 2 last cents to wrap off this podcast?
Okay, so I've been doing this more or less for over 20 years. And what I would say is that the world is never as dark as it might seem. It's never as bright as it might seem either. But there is always, at any time, there are always technologies and regions and business models that are booming. So don't over-index to the fact that there's some IRA mechanism that may be under threat, or vehicle standards in America. America is, at the end of the day, it's something like 16% of global energy use, and of that, private cars is only a piece. So don't over-index. Don't read the news, frankly. Or if you read the news with the eye of, okay, where is it working? Where is there progress? I say Pakistan, 22 gigawatts of solar. I'm not saying go to Pakistan, but right across the Sun Belt, think about what the impact of cheap solar and cheap batteries is going to, what is that going to do in the next 3, 4, 5 years? There is nothing, anybody listening to this, there's nothing to say that you have to continue to operate in Norway, right? Or that you have to continue to operate in Europe, or you have to continue to operate in Germany or in the US. Go where the opportunity is, and the opportunities are absolutely categorically there. And if I might say one other thing, work on stuff that works. And by that, what I mean is there's a whole, the part of the reset that I'm, talking more and more about is we've been through a period where everything that looks like a solution is being given the sort of same amount of airtime, right? We've done this very well. We're in the last minutes, and we haven't used the word hydrogen yet. But, when you look at solutions that will cost $2,000, $3,000, $5,000 a ton for abatement, and it is entirely unclear how they can get that down to, let's say, $150 a ton or $200 a ton or $50 a ton or negative, right? There is no pathway. Don't work on that stuff. Don't publicize it. Just walk away, because it's not happening, and it shouldn't happen. There should be a grand scraping off of barnacles. E-fuels, forget it. Just forget it. It's not going to happen. Hydrogen aeroplanes, forget it. We can't get hydrogen to airports, so forget it. Not going to happen. And focus on stuff. In a way, this stuff is very, very, very simple. We know all around the world, we can decarbonize the electricity supply, right? It's happening in every single country, even the ones that don't care. We're decarbonizing the electricity supply. We know how to electrify land transport. And to do it, the truck company, the truck charging company, Pragmacharge, that I'm building, we are doing e-trucking cheaper than diesel for regional routes. So land transportation, we know how to do it, all of it, frankly. Heating, we know how to do all of it. We electrify it. Right? It's not going to be a hydrogen boiler. If Mr. Aiwanger is listening to this, I will guarantee that there will be no hydrogen boilers in Bavaria in 10 or 15 years. The ones you pay for right now will have a short life, and then they will be gone. There will be no hydrogen in heating. We know that. Heating will all go electric, one way or another. Right? And then industrial energy use, industrial heat, half of it is low temperature, will all go electric. It can pay for itself going electric pretty much now. So this is kind of 80% of the problem is we already have line of sight on the solutions. Low carbon electricity with low carbon transportation, with low carbon heating, with low carbon industrial heat for at least half of it is absolutely clear how to do it. Why work on stupid stuff that is thousands of dollars per ton of carbon and hard to do, and there's no supply chain and there's no policy environment? There's just talk. Let's stop talking about that stuff.
I love the energy. He is the co-founder of Pragmacharge. He is the CEO and principal of Liebreich Associates. He is a senior contributor still to Bloomberg, and he is the co-managing partner of EcoPragma Capital. Thanks for joining me for this podcast today, Michael Liebreich.
Julius, it's a great pleasure.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.